Okay, so I am here with Michael Bueckert. Michael Bueckert is the Vice President for the Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. And we are here today to talk about Doug Ford's most recent declaration that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism, is now going to be the working definition of anti-Semitism in the province. And so thank you, Michael, for being here. So one of the questions I have for you is, what is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism?
So the IHRA, or IHRA, is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which at a high international level, some groups have agreed upon and have been trying to introduce locally at different levels with governments around the world. And so why it's a concern is because in the examples that are attached to the definition, about 7 out of 11 of the examples refer to Israel or Zionism in some way. So saying that Israel is a racist endeavor, or applying double standards to Israel that you wouldn't to any other country, things which are incredibly vague and ambiguous, and in effect could be applied to virtually any form of criticism or protest of Israel. If someone thinks that a specific political expression about Israel is unfair, they can claim it to be in violation of this definition. And because there's no real firm guidance for public authorities on how to interpret it, it means that pretty much any political expression could be targeted and potentially censored by different institutions. So that's why it's essentially a threat, but it's also why pro-Israel groups are so interested in passing it at every level of government.
Right, and I know like white supremacy is a real issue here in Canada. Anti-Semitism is sadly very, very prevalent in our society. And so what I hear you saying is that it's the content of the bill, the inability to criticize Israel is what I hear you saying.
Right, yeah, I think ourselves, as well as I know groups like Independent Jewish Voices, agree that this bill doesn't really do anything to advance safety for Jewish Canadians here, or to address the sources of growing anti-Semitism, which we see by far on the far right with white supremacist groups who are emboldened in part by Donald Trump and the rise of these far right movements. Instead, it focuses almost entirely, well, not entirely, but to a significant amount on forms of speech that have to do with Israel or Zionism, which unfortunately has this awful effect of that when we should be talking about how to address white supremacy, how we should be opposing anti-Semitism, how do we make our community safer for Jewish Canadians. Instead, we inevitably get pulled into a conversation about Israel and what we are or not allowed to say about it. So it's quite a perverse situation that we're in right now.
Okay, so the IHRA was passed through an ordering council. So there was no debate, there was no opportunity for opposition, and no real opportunity to have input from the public. How is this an assault on democracy, and why do you think Doug Ford chose this process?
Yeah, those are good questions. So it started off as a private member's bill for the government to adopt IHRA and its definitions. And it passed second reading earlier this year, before COVID even, so quite a while ago. And at that point, even the Ontario NDP voted for the bill at second reading for the purpose of it going to the committee stage and to have public hearings and to get community input. And then they said they'd make up their decision. So that was part of their strategy. So we've waited a long time. Suddenly, we found out, I think it was last week, all of a sudden that the Justice Committee of the legislature was going to be, they were meeting to discuss this bill, and they announced that this week there was supposed to be 2 days of of public hearings where community groups could submit written comments, or they could request to participate and testify before the committee about this bill. And so I know that there were a lot of community groups who were very interested. We applied to participate. Canadian Palestinian groups were participating. IJV obviously was going to participate. There were a lot, the IHRA is very unpopular among civil society, with Canadian Labour Congress opposes it, the Federation of Students, lots of different groups are opposed to it. So presumably there was going to be significant public interest, significant participation. Today was supposed to be the first day of public hearings. What we found out yesterday, late yesterday, so not even 24 hours before presumably we're going to be talking about the potential issues with the bill, we found out that the government had in fact pulled the bill. What I think happened is that the Ontario government decided that they were going to support it anyway. Usually private members' bills don't necessarily get passed, but the government decided they were going to take it on and support it no matter what. And I mean, my guess is that they saw all of the thousands of emails coming in opposing the bill. They saw all of the public opposition in social media, and they made a decision: we're not going to, we don't want to have to deal with public input. We're just going to pass it ourselves. Why go to the public? Why go through the democratic process when we can just get it passed right now? And I think the saddest part of it is that all of these groups were preparing to discuss it, including Palestinian Canadians who are, preparing to speak about how this bill could potentially affect their ability to talk about their own histories and experiences with Israeli violence and dispossession. While this was happening, behind the scenes, the government was collaborating with a number of pro-Israel groups to cancel this process and to go to the Order in Council. And that's how we found out about it. No one who applied to participate was notified that the public hearings were canceled. Instead, we saw a press release from pro-Israel groups saying, congratulating the government on passing it. So I think it's a tremendous insult to the public at large and those who wanted to participate, and a real contempt for democracy. And I think this silencing of the public is really reflective in a way of what the bill itself it was supposed to do, which really is to narrow the space for public debate on important issues, specifically regarding Israeli violence.
Right, thank you. So another question we have is, this could have sweeping implications of criminalizing Palestinian solidarity movements. And so what are the implications of this? I know there are professors that could be targeted as a result of this. Palestinian solidarity movement could be targeted. Student groups on campuses could be targeted. What do you see as the implications here?
So potentially quite sweeping. We know that the initial Bill 168 was put forward as part of sort of a whole of government approach to combating anti-Semitism, and would theoretically apply to virtually any public authority would have to rely on the IHRA definition to evaluate circumstances to determine whether they are anti-Semitic. So presumably any public institution, universities, other public spaces, police, all sorts of different authorities would have to take it into account. So potentially the threat is quite high to Palestine activism and just criticism of Israel. However, I would say that there's nothing in the IHRA definition that automatically cancels speech on Palestine, that automatically invokes censorship. It all comes down to interpretation and whether it's enforced according to that interpretation. So we know that most of the groups who are behind Bill 68 that were pushing for it and who celebrated the government yesterday are right now engaging in censorship campaigns against people who have engaged in speech that is critical of Israel, often referring to the IHRA as a reason why a university should, for example, ban students from boycotting Israel, or to ban Israeli Apartheid Week or Students Against Israeli Apartheid from acting on campus. They're right now petitioning universities to disqualify people from jobs because they've criticized Israel in their scholarship. They are petitioning York University to ban a lecturer from teaching human rights courses because he has criticized Zionism as part of a debate. So we know right now that, and there's plenty of examples, that the groups who are most supportive of this bill see it explicitly as applying to anti-Zionism, to the BDS campaign, to comparisons of Israel to apartheid South Africa, and other forms of speech. Even we see in the United States, Trump is preparing to declare that groups like Amnesty International or Oxfam or Human Rights Watch are anti-Semitic organizations based on the fact that they report on Israeli violations of human rights as they report on violations everywhere. So, so absolutely the groups behind this who are supporting it see it as a way to censor speech on Palestine, and that is their explicit goal. However, whether or not institutions see it the same way, because the language of the definition is so broad, it really comes up to them to adjudicate those conflicts and decide whether or not specific form of political expression is anti-Semitic. So that's an unfortunate situation to be in too, because public authorities do not have the tools to do this. If someone comes to them and says, this photo exhibit in this public space on political prisoners, this violates the IHRA, public authorities don't have the ability to determine whether that is or is not anti-Semitic. If someone has a lecture on a one-state solution, how everyone in the region should have equal rights within a single political body, if someone complains that that is anti-Semitic or it violates the IHRA, will public authorities be able to evaluate whether that is true or not? I don't think they will. And so what's likely to happen is that they will be applying it liberally, or people will just avoid speaking out because they're afraid, even if it doesn't end up being enforced in sort of the most heavy-handed way, people are still be afraid that if they say something the wrong way, that they'll be targeted, and that there's a real risk of censorship regardless. So, so my answer is it's complicated, the effects, but there's real, really serious implications for it.
Right, and I want to broaden the conversation just a little bit here, because what we are seeing across Canada is governments cracking down on protests. So you have Jason Kenney in Alberta, you have an anti-blockade bill being proposed in Manitoba. I also know earlier this summer, the Toronto Police started using conspiracy charges against activists again. And so we are seeing this pattern of political dissent being criminalized. Do you see this fitting into that pattern?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're not necessarily related in a conscious sense, but I think that there is a new rise in social movements, in energy behind the Black Lives Matter movement, behind these Indigenous blockades, and other resistance protest movements. And I think authorities are acting accordingly, and they are cracking down on speech and protest in a lot of different ways. And in some cases, they are relying or they're looking at other examples to see what is effective. Jason Kenney in Alberta, the way that he talks about the foreign-funded radical extremists when referring to environmentalists, and the crackdown on charities, the crackdown on NGOs, sort of any criticism of the industry is traitorous to the province. I think all of that fits in or is directly borrowed from the language that Israel uses under Netanyahu to talk about the boycott movement and how they should think about human rights observers and that sort of thing. So I think there is cross-pollination for sure. And but at the same time, of course, we've seen repression of Palestine activism in Canada happening, I mean, at least for 2 decades at a high pitch. So in a way, it's nothing new, but it definitely is related. And I think we can learn from each other in terms of different struggles against oppression and colonialism everywhere.
Thank you so much, Michael. I mean, you've highlighted how this is concerning, not just for the Palestine Solidarity Movement and those working for justice in Palestine, how this process has been an assault on our democracy, and how this does sort of fit into a larger pattern. And so what can we do now that this has been passed? What can we do now? What should we be doing? What actions can we be taking?
Well, I think because it happened so suddenly and so recently, we're going to have to take some time to discuss and to think about and to brainstorm new ways forward. And I know those discussions are already happening. And Also, I think ultimately it'll probably come down to individual cases of someone trying to enforce the IHRA definition in a way that that censors speech. I think we're going to have to be prepared to come to vigorously oppose any attempts to enforce the definition in that way wherever it may take place. So, so the fight continues.
Thank you so much, and we will be listening and watching to hear what you are going to tell us to do. I hope you will be guiding us along this journey so we can ensure that freedom of speech and Palestine solidarity movement stays strong across Ontario. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.